James Warren is our next speaker. He's a retired diplomat and 2020 Oxfordian of the Year. Jim edited the centenary edition of J. Thomas Looney's Shakespeare Identified and subsequently published Shakespeare Revealed, bringing to light 43 lost articles and letters published subsequent to the publication of Shakespeare Identified. He is the editor of the Index of Oxfordian Publications, a massive tome that he has been publishing now in its fourth edition, which is a great resource that I use all the time. So he is also the author of the novel Summer Storm, which is a story of a professor and the students wrestling with how we know what we know, among other things, the authorship of Shakespeare's works. Jim is presenting on the Oxfordian movement and academia. Take it away, Jim.
Well, greetings, everyone. At the online symposium last October, I identified 3 levels of resistance to the Oxfordian claim, 3 factors that made it difficult for many people to accept Edward de Vere as the mind and personality behind the pen name William Shakespeare. The first type is human resistance, the normal resistance that most people feel when their long-held beliefs are challenged. The second, cognitive resistance, is the resistance the mind feels when confronted by a claim as complex as the Oxfordian claim. And third is institutional resistance from academia. That's what I want to talk more about today. Now, over the last few years, I've spent a lot of time studying the history of the Oxfordian idea introduced by John Thomas Looney 101 years ago. I put my findings and my thoughts about them into a book that will come out probably in the next month or two, hopefully by the end of May. Whoops. Okay, it's titled Shakespeare Revolutionized, the First 100 Years of John Thomas Looney's Shakespeare Identified. It's just what the subtitle implies. It tells the story of how Looney's book has influenced thinking about Shakespeare over the past century. It tells 3 stories. Those of how the Oxfordian idea has influenced public opinion, how it has given rise to an Oxfordian movement, and how it has engendered resistance within academia. Now, it took me 800 pages to tell those stories. Here's a proof of the book, which is also proof that the book actually exists. You can see how thick it is. It maybe for some people looks like a phone book. I tried as hard as I could to make it as thin as possible, but it did take 800 pages. But the pages aren't solid text. There are images and text boxes to break up the text a bit. On this page is an image of Cecil Palmer's advertisement for Shakespeare Identified from the Times Literary Supplement on the day the book was published. And on this page is a text box. I provided text boxes for 22 of the most important Oxfordian scholars in the first quarter century of the Oxfordian movement. Shown here is Colonel Bernard Ward, who founded the Shakespeare Fellowship in 1922. Now, one thing I found during my research was that during the first wave of the Oxfordian movement, from 1920 through the mid-1940s, was that Oxfordians had made considerable progress in overcoming human resistance and cognitive resistance, but little progress in overcoming institutional resistance. And it's pretty much the same story today. During the second wave of the Oxfordian movement that began with the publication of Charlton Ogburn's The Mysterious William Shakespeare at the end of 1984. The reason that progress has been made in overcoming the first 2 types of resistance, but not the third, is, I believe, that institutional resistance is distinctly different from the first 2 types. Institutional resistance is a difference in kind from the first 2, just as animals are a difference in kind from plants, even though both are forms of life. The first 2 types of resistance are similar in that both deal with individuals. Differences between them are matters of degree only. But institutional resistance, which deals with institutions, not individuals, is a difference in kind from the other 2. Although we deal with people within academia, those people are not individuals acting as individuals. They're acting as representatives of their institutions. And that makes all the difference. So because there's a difference in kind, a different strategy is needed to deal with institutional resistance. To understand this better, we need to look within academia. Now, for simplicity's sake, during this short talk, I'll divide people within academia into two categories: leaders and everybody else. Leaders of academic departments have two duties: promoting scholarly work within their departments and promoting the interests of their departments themselves. These two duties are distinctly different and sometimes in conflict with each other. When conflicts arise, leaders must seek to identify and further the optimal balance between them, not pursue either to the maximum extent possible. Their goal must be the philosopher's totem bonum, not the summum bonum. Everybody else, like leaders, also has two duties. They have the duty of producing scholarly work and that of remaining in good standing in their institution. Their two duties, like those of the leaders, sometimes conflict with each other, and in such situations, they must do what their leaders do: determine the optimal balance between them. Now, in this very simplified scenario, during the first wave of the Oxfordian movement back in the 1920s and 30s, leaders of departments of literature determined that the Oxfordian challenge to Stratfordian beliefs was not a mere scholarly matter. It was a challenge to the department's prestige and status. As a direct challenge to their good name, it had to be repelled at all costs, regardless of the effect that doing so might have had on the scholarly work carried out within the departments. For everybody else within literature departments, when it came to the Oxfordian claim, 6 factors or types of pressure affected their thinking, and the net effect of them was a strong bias against consideration of it. The first 2 factors, A and B in this equation, are those common to all people, the human and cognitive forms of resistance. The final 4 affect those within academia. Avoidance of disruption to scholarly work is an important factor for professors, for scholars, because it takes a great deal of mental effort to the rest of the world, to free their mind from other considerations so they can focus on their scholarly work. And for many of them, the authorship question and the Oxfordian challenge was a disruption to their work. Many scholars had vested personal interests in the Stratfordian story because they'd been teaching it and writing about it for so many years. They faced institutional pressure to adhere to the party line from the leaders at the head of their departments and from their peers. And they faced what they recognized as their scholarly duty to pursue the truth of literary matters. So of these 6 factors weighing on professors, 5 push against consideration of the Oxfordian claim. Only 1 supports it. So the result was a bias against examination of the Oxfordian theory. Now, this situation has been expressed in several pithy aphorisms. Here are 2. George Bernard Shaw is reputed to have said that you cannot convert a man whose living depends upon your not converting him. And Upton Sinclair is rumored to have said something similar. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. In sum, then, institutional resistance is a difference in kind from the other 2 types because it comes from institutions, not individuals. It's actively hostile to the Oxfordian claim. It's well organized and it's well funded with a range of resources and capabilities that can be used to defeat the Oxfordian thesis. And so again, it's a mistake, I believe, to believe that Oxfordians can overcome institutional resistance by following the same strategy that is effective with the other 2 forms of resistance. And yet it is imperative that institutional resistance be overcome because until it is, all other gains are at risk. The gains Oxfordians have made with public opinion are in danger of being swept away because of pressure flowing outward from academia. The progress made in overcoming human resistance and cognitive resistance is vulnerable to being reversed by academia's hostility to the Oxfordian claim. Many of you may be familiar with the board game Othello, in which two opponents attempt to flip each other's pieces so that their color, black or white, dominates the board. In this game, the side that appears to be winning, that has more pieces on the board in its color, can easily find its seeming dominance reversed by a few adroit moves by its opponent. It remains vulnerable until the game is over. As I see it, that's the situation the Oxfordian movement is in until institutional resistance is overcome. Our gains can be reversed. And so it is imperative that Oxfordians figure out what strategy will be effective in engaging academia. Again, it will not be the same strategy that has been effective in overcoming the first two types of resistance because institutions are a difference in kind from individuals. Now, in Shakespeare Revolutionized, I devote 6 chapters to examining academia's response to the Oxfordian challenge. 3 look at its response during the first wave of the Oxfordian movement, and 3 examine its response today. Returning to the 3 stories I mentioned earlier, or maybe I skipped that slide. Anyways, the effect that Shakespeare identified has had on public opinion and on the development of an Oxfordian movement over the past century can be easily seen. When an American sitcom has a character who is an Oxfordian played by Christopher Lloyd, that demonstrates very clearly that the idea of Edward de Vere's Shakespeare has reached a certain depth of penetration into public consciousness. When Mark Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name is on the shelves at Barnes & Noble, that says something similar. There we go. With academia, though, the influence is there, but it's beneath the surface. The Oxfordian claim has influenced or affected academia much more deeply than most Shakespeare scholars will admit. It has become the black hole around which traditional scholars conduct their work as they desperately seek ways to avoid having to examine the authorship issue in the same objective manner that they study all other literary matters. Now, I've spent 6 years investigating the first 100 years of the Oxfordian movement, in part because I enjoyed it. And I've written this book because I enjoyed doing that too. But that's not the full story. I've invested so much time and effort in these activities, not merely to write an historical study, as important as that may be, but to try to determine what strategy would put the Oxfordian idea over the top. When I began, I hoped to learn what strategies for promoting the Oxfordian thesis over the past century had and hadn't worked, so that I could design a strategy that would be effective in convincing universities, colleges, and schools to teach that William Shakespeare was a pen name used by Edward de Vere, just as they teach that Mark Twain is a pen name used by Samuel Longhorn Clemens. So after 24 chapters of building up to it, Shakespeare Revolutionized concludes with a chapter explaining my ideas on how the Oxfordian Revolution might finally be completed. The strategy itself is too big a subject to go into here, where the limited amount of time available has restricted me to a mere introduction to the subject of how best to engage academia. But one important aspect of the solution involves seeking out allies and motivating them to engage departments of literature on the authorship question. I'll give you 2 quick examples. Historians, departments of history, and professional bodies of historians might be incensed to learn how severely the history of the Elizabethan era has been corrupted by bad ideas flowing out of Shakespeare studies. And they could perhaps be encouraged to express their disappointment directly to Shakespeare scholars. Legal organizations might be angered to learn that Shakespeare's extensive legal knowledge is dismissed by many Shakespeare scholars, and the valid concept of circumstantial evidence is disparaged within Shakespeare studies. They too can be encouraged to express their dismay directly to Shakespeare studies sections. And with that, I'll stop here and be happy to take any questions you might have.
Well, I'm relating what Rick Wagerman's asked. Jim, one thing we can do is join mainstream organizations such as the Shakespeare Association of America and the more open-minded Renaissance Society of America. Both organizations are international in scope.
That's a great idea, because the more forums that we can present the Oxfordian idea to, the better, the closer we'll get to the paradigm shift that we all want to see.
Shelley Maycock has asked a question. What do you think about the idea that the money-making Shakespeare industry, for example, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and other academic wings, Oxford and their institute, as well as the Folger Shakespeare Library, and much more, in cahoots with the NEH, which dole out how much needed research and promotional money also determine the actions of academe?
Well, money is certainly of overwhelming importance. I know several professors who spend much of their time pursuing grants, filling out grant forms, and trying to get the funding they need for their research. And so, the NEH and the other big foundations, the Ford Foundation and so on, seem to listen to Stratfordians when making decisions about what academic projects are worth funding. And since they all seem to have the same opinion and all go to the same scholars within academia for advice on what projects to fund, I don't have, well, I guess what that emphasizes is the need to overcome the resistance within academia, because so many others apply, they turn to academia for its opinion on what projects or what subjects are worth funding. The NEH does that, the media does that, the public turns to academia. So that just reinforces the point I made earlier, that we must overcome the academic resistance to the Oxfordian claim. We cannot work only with individuals outside of academia. We have to conquer the institutional resistance.
Joella Werland asked, what about focusing on the Folger? And I think particularly in the idea of the 400th anniversary of the publication of the first folio.
Well, that's for us a very, very important anniversary. In my book, in one of the chapters, I talk about Roger's phenomenal special issue of Brief Chronicles that focused on the first folio tour in 2016. I'm really hoping that he does something similar related to the anniversary coming up 2 years from now, because it's a great opportunity for us to get our message out, because the media is always looking for a hook, for something that's new, for some angle it can use to before it will address a subject. And so that anniversary gives us the hook that we need. If we can somehow play on that, it's an opportunity for us to get our message about the Oxfordian authorship out into the media.
Diane Elliott recently asked a question of engaging high school teachers, as was done recently at their NCTE conference in Baltimore last year or 2 years ago, helps create the students who will ask questions in their university Shakespeare classes. Any history of this type of action going on?
I don't know. I haven't been involved firsthand in those activities, but I heard reports from that conference of high school teachers that were very positive. Teachers, from the reports I heard, had far more interest in the subject and said that their students were far more interested in it than reports I've heard about university professors. James Shapiro even said that if any student brings up the authorship question in his classes, he'll flunk the student. But I think that sort of attitude is far rarer among high school students. So they're a definite way that if we can reach them by attending future conferences of high school students, provide information to them, teaching curriculum, syllabi, and so on that they can use. I think that's a great a great way to proceed. And we should do that to the fullest extent that it's open to us.
Alexander Waugh has added a comment. Academia is a general term. Should we not be splitting history from English lit? Historians are far less biased.
Historians, I think, are far less biased, but you know, Shakespeare studies has such cachet and such status that no one wants to be seen as being out of line with Shakespeare studies. So that's one of the problems that I outline in one of the chapters of the book. Even historians, when it comes to the Elizabethan era and anything relating to Shakespeare, if they hear ideas that contradict what the usual story, they often go to Shakespeare scholars in their universities to check with them on how valid these ideas are. And of course, if they're Oxfordian ideas, they get the thumbs down from the university professors. So we need to encourage historians to be even more independent, especially when it comes to Shakespeare, than I think they've been in the past.
Ronald Cutting mentions a good point. What do you think about the efforts of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition's Declaration of Reasonable Doubt? The signatory count is closing in on 5,000 notable signatories and are nearing a notable 100 and almost 1,000 academic signatures. So a total of 5,000 notable signatories, nearing 100 and almost 1,000 academic signatures.
Yeah, well, the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt was a brilliant idea, and I know John Shahan and the SAC have worked very hard to implement it and promote it and publicize it and get signatures, because it's a great way of separating the authorship question or doubts about Shakespeare from the Oxfordian question. You know, it simplifies the issue. If we can focus only on doubts about Shakespeare and not worry about alternate candidates who would replace him as author. In a sense, it simplifies things by separating the two issues. I've talked about this in one of the chapters of my book too. I think it's fair to say that the Declaration, although it's a brilliant idea, it hasn't quite caught on. The media hasn't quite picked it up and publicized it the way that the SAC and John Shahan had hoped. But that's no reason not to continue with that effort. It's a brilliant idea, and it could be that maybe its time hasn't come yet, but its time will come, and we need to keep it out there in the public idea or public eye as much as possible, because the greater the doubts grow, the more, it's like a rock going downhill, snowball rolling downhill. It starts slowly, but it gets faster and faster as it goes down. And that could be what will happen with the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. It could catch on, and there may be 5,000 signatures now. There could be 50,000 a year or two from now, or at the time of the anniversary of the first folio in 2 years. And who knows? In 10 years, it could be 1 million. As I said, it's a great idea, and they need to keep pushing that and publicizing it to the greatest extent possible.
Brian Woodland asked the question, when Darwin published his theory of evolution, how did it become accepted despite institutional, scientific, and religious resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I addressed that subject also in one of the chapters. But I note that two things. One is that the idea had a strong and aggressive promoter of the idea, other than Darwin himself. Thomas Huxley, T.H. Huxley, was known as Darwin's bulldog for the aggressive way he promoted the idea. And that made a big difference. The Oxfordian idea also had a bulldog, and I talked about this in one of the books. Percy Allen could have been described as Darwin's bulldog for the aggressive way that he promoted the Oxfordian idea in books and articles and letters to editors and public talks that he gave. He gave more public talks on the Oxfordian idea than anyone else in the first quarter century of the Oxfordian movement. The other idea, thing I want to say about Darwin's theory is that uh, it was of interest to biologists, but it didn't quite convince the majority of biologists, I think, until population genetics explained, which came along 50 years later, explained how traits were passed on. You know, Mendel's pea plants and so on led into population genetics, which explained how genes code for, you know, before they knew about genes and chromosomes and so on, it was very hard to convince people that Darwin's theory was right because he couldn't explain how it worked. So there was two phases in the process of acceptance of that idea. And it could be that the Oxfordian idea hasn't quite had its second phase yet. We're still stuck on the first phase, and that might be what's holding back full acceptance of it.
Two academics have posted questions that will conclude our commentaries today. Jim, Don Rubin is saying that he somewhat disagrees with the party line that being pushed by universities, hiring committees simply hire people who agree with them and rarely risk unless they are given a specific mandate, such as to create diversity. How can we make Oxfordianism part of the diversity movement? Must we find a way to make it an interesting issue? And Andrew Salzman, so Don's raising the question of diversity. Andrew Salzman writes, speaking as an academic of 40 years, the only way to change academia, which is a bastion motivated by nearly always by greed and prestige, is to enlist a champion that is within their lair, who is so prestigious that their word threatens the others with their prestige. You need to find one key opinion leader who is so prestigious he or she can speak to the truth without fear of retribution. So Don saying diversity, Andrew saying find a spear-shaking, you know, prestigious colleague. Well, in England, of course, Sir Derek Jacobi and Sir Mark Rylance have been prestigious advocates of our cause in Great Britain. But anyway, any further ideas or responses to Don's and Andrew's issues they've raised?
Yeah, well, yeah, you know, I've laid out an in-depth strategy for the core of the strategy is not in persuading professors, it's in forcing them to address the issue by bringing pressure to bear on them from many sources, from many allies. The diversity issue, intellectual diversity does not seem to be the sort of diversity that's promoted within universities. So I don't quite see how that would work. On the idea of someone like James Shapiro or Jonathan Bate or some known academic inside the university walls, if someone of that stature came out in favor of an objective consideration of the authorship question within academia, or even support for the Oxfordian idea, then there'd be no need for my strategy. We can throw out chapter 25 of my book because that's what we want to happen as a result of my strategy, is that someone, some very senior respected academic comes out publicly in support of the Oxfordian claim. So that's really what needs to happen. There needs to be basically a civil war take place within academia, within Shakespeare studies. And my strategy is designed to sort of be the atom bomb that will launch the nuclear bomb, the hydrogen bomb within academia.
Thank you so much, Jim. You let the revolution begin.